Hello again, everybody. Welcome to your continuation of the lesson on RNIP. So in the previous lesson, we discussed the community requirements. And in this lesson, we will talk about the aspiring Canadian or future Canadian or whatever you want to call this person. But we will talk about the requirements that are needed in order for that person to become Canadian through this program. So there's two parts to it, of course. One is simply the community requirements. It has to be the right community, and of course it has to be the right applicant for PR. So we will discuss this, of course, as it pertains to your upcoming ICCRC exam in this lesson. All right, so let's take a step back. We'll see all the different kind of perspectives in this topic. So in the previous lesson, we talked about the community. We talked about how the government makes these new programs, who has the authority to do this. Does it contravene the IRPA, the regulations, to make new programs like this? Of course not. It goes with the objectives of the IRPA. So again, we won't go back to that again. We know this already. This is where it gets interesting again, of course, is when you take a look at this and you're thinking of yourself in about maybe a year, maybe 6 months, when you're starting to get your first clients, and that's a pretty exciting time. Well, you might choose to work with this program. I know a lot of RCICs who work with this program already. They love it. It's pretty fantastic. And again, when you think of this through the perspective of a future Canadian, well, it's such a home run because, I mean, a lot of people want to go to the bigger cities, but a lot of people, I mean, think of this for your clients. A lot of people can go to these smaller communities and have amazing lives, amazing jobs. Their kids are happy, the families are happy. But it all starts, of course, with choosing the perfect program for the perfect applicant. Okay, so we need to, of course, take a look at this through the perspective of your upcoming ICCRC exam. And how will we do this? Well, I'm glad you asked. We will take a look at this through two perspectives. So we have the community requirements. Now, we talked about this in the previous lesson on the RNIP community requirements. And in this one, we'll focus more on the worker, the permanent resident. So when I say worker PR, I mean the same person. So we're going to focus on this one in this lesson. And those two pieces of information together, of course, will help you really master this topic. All right, so we're obviously going to be as concise as possible in this video. It shouldn't take too long to work through this. Maybe it'll be 25. This is just the beginning, so I don't really know how long it'll take, but I'm guessing 25 minutes will be what this lesson will be. If you feel like you need to continue reading afterwards, go for it. Here's the links for you. They are just below this video. You can click on them and work through them. The first one is the best one, all right? So Guide 0118 about the RNIP. It gives really step-by-step instructions for this. All right, so let's take a look at the relationship between PNPs and RNIP. So we have those federal requirements that a person must meet. A person must be admissible. That's the biggest one, right? Now, when we take a look at PNPs, remember that a PNP cannot contravene, of course, federal requirements for immigration. A person has to be admissible. That's a federal requirement. There are, of course, other ones as well. Now, let's say that a province nominates a person, and then the federal government says that this person is not admissible. Well, then, of course, the federal government, the IRCC, has the ultimate say in whether or not this person can immigrate to Canada, regardless of if the PNP nominated him. Now, what if the person is admissible, let's say, but the provincial authorities say that this person does not meet their requirements? Well, that's perfectly fine as well. The province does not need to accept that person either. So when we think of that, so PNPs are amazing. It's the future of immigration, right? Localized immigration is the future of immigration. We're going to see more and more PNPs. If you've been in the immigration world for a few years. So for myself, it's been about 7 years, 8 years now. And there are more and more PNPs all the time. For getting ready for your exam, I know it's one of the very difficult areas to cover because PNPs change all the time. Well, and it goes with this whole approach of more localized immigration. Personally, I think it's such a benefit for everybody. I think it's beneficial for the immigrants themselves. I think for a lot of immigrants, they want to go somewhere where they will be stable. So where they'll have employment, where the kids will be happy and that kind of thing. And I think for a lot of immigrants as well, they often say they want to go to Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal or Calgary just because they've heard of those places before. But there are all these amazing communities all across Canada. So for you as RCICs, be sure to explore those with your clients, because sometimes you have a client who might not be that competitive in express entry, for example, but maybe the person is a perfect fit for a certain PNP. All right, but even within those PNPs, remember that they need to follow those federal requirements. Well, RNIPs have the same idea. Now, the way that we looked at the AIPP in the Atlantic lesson, where we took a look and we said, okay, well, it's basically a group of provinces that kind of have a common PNP across them. And that's a good way to think of the AIPP. It's also a good way to think of the RNIP. Now, the RNIP is a group of provinces that have some common requirements between them. So it's similar to a PNP, but with a lot of provinces. What are those provinces? Well, we saw that in the previous lesson, right? So it's pretty much every province, well, and some of the territories, with the exception of, it's mostly the Western provinces, right? So it's not Quebec, not Atlantic Canada, not Newfoundland, but BC, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and some of the territories. Okay, so they have some common requirements in there. Now there is a further step though with RNIP, and that is the community requirements. So we do have kind of 3 steps of requirements that a person must meet in order to obtain PR through this. We talked about those community requirements in order for a community to be able to sponsor a PR. In the previous lesson on this topic, we're going to focus more on the individual in this lesson who wants to obtain PR. So that individual would need to meet the community requirements. That individual would need to meet the general RNIP requirements, and of course, those federal requirements, just like anybody else. So in this little section here, we're going to first begin by looking at those RNIP requirements. Then we're going to dig into the community requirements just a little bit, just to give you an idea of what those are. All right, so what are those requirements for the RNIP? Well, you've got them all right here. Now, this is, of course, for the RNIP itself. We're not talking about the community requirements just yet. We're going to talk about that in a few slides here to give you an example. But for the RNIP, we have these requirements. Now, some of these seem pretty easy, such as language, education, etc. Some of them can be a little bit tricky. So we're going to do a mix of the easy ones and the tricky ones as we carry on with this lesson. All right, so let's start off with what I think is the easiest one, and that is intent. So a couple of minutes ago, we talked about RNIP, and we said basically a really good way to view this is to think of the RNIP as a group of provinces that have a common PNP. That's an easy way to think of it. Now, when we think of PNPs, remember we had a lesson on intent. Well, intent goes into, of course, the RNIP as well, even though the RNIP is a little bit more specific in terms of where the person will live. So with a regular PNP, the person has to intend, of course, to live in the province. Well, with the RNIP, we go a little bit deeper, and the person needs to intend to live in the community. So this list over here on the right, these are the communities that are participating at this moment. I mean, this can change anytime, of course. But we've got, you can see kind of smaller communities across Western Canada, as we talked about before. So you've got Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC. So just like we talked about before. Now, How do we know if a person truly intends to live in that community? Well, it's the same idea that we discussed in that P&P lesson on intent and provincial nominee programs. The big question that comes up is over here, of course. Let's say a person immigrates through this program, the RNIP. Does that mean that the person is chained to that community? So the person cannot leave that community ever? No. The big question is, of course, did the person truly intend to live in that community when the person immigrated through the RNIP? If the answer is yes, so let's say a person got, I won't go into this too much because we have a whole lesson on it, but let's say that a person immigrates through the RNIP, settles in North Bay or one of the other communities that are in this program, and then a couple years later gets a job offer to go to Calgary. Well, c'est la vie, as they say, right? But the person truly intended to settle in the community, so that means that he did not misrepresent himself or anything like that. All right, so another step for us is that EDO recommendation. So remember, the EDO stands for the Economic Development Organization of the local community. So we saw the relationship that the EDO plays in getting a community to be able to sponsor or support a foreign national for PR, so that person can settle in that community and, of course, help build up that economy, that culture of that community as well. And just to reiterate what that EDO does, well, I mean, if you've ever gone to like a networking event or something like that at a Chamber of Commerce, it's pretty much that. So it's an organization that helps a community grow their economy. Now, remember, the role that the EDO plays in this is that they have to work quite a bit in the pilot program. So part of this is, of course, recommending certain people for PR through this program. And that, of course, means that the foreign national would work closely with that EDO. So let's say, for example, a organization approaches an EDO. So let's say a company in the community needs to hire a certain amount of people for a certain project. Well, they can approach the EDO and see if they can help. Well, the EDO would maybe have this at their disposal, the RNIP. So they would be able to look through their kind of portfolio of people and see if there's a good match in there. This is, of course, after making sure that there isn't a Canadian or permanent resident who can do the job. So a foreign national would need to first get in touch with that EDO in order for the EDO to recommend this person. Now, we're going to take a look at this very specifically in the next slide. We'll take a look at the example of the Sault, so that's Sault Ste. Marie. And we'll take a look at what they are specifically doing with this program to give us, again, a better idea of this requirement, but of course, the whole process in general. All right, so in this little section here, I wanted to go and take a step a bit further into this, which is taking a look at the community requirements. We're right in the middle of looking at the RNIP requirements, but in the next 3 slides, we will take a look at what one community specifically is looking for in this program, and we'll be able to see really in context how this works in real life. All right, so we'll take a look at the Sault Ste. Marie website here to get an example of those community requirements. Now, do you need to know the very specific requirements of every single community? I would say no. I would say it's more important, of course, to understand the general requirements for RNIP in terms of the community itself and, of course, in terms of the applicant himself or herself. But over here, I mean, we have a good opportunity to explore one of those programs. And even if you're thinking beyond the exam, all of these little niche markets are great areas for you to explore. I know we have people who are all across Canada who are starting companies looking for niche markets where they can be the RNIP person, for example, or maybe it's caregivers or maybe another program. Well, if you're in the Sault, it might be a good opportunity for you to explore this program. So when we take a look at these steps over here, we can see it's a mix really of meeting community requirements and meeting RNIP requirements and meeting federal requirements. If you take a look at step 1 even, it's the federal requirements. If a person doesn't meet those federal requirements, well, it's impossible for them to meet the RNIP requirements and therefore impossible for them to meet the community requirements. So when we take a look at this, of course, you can see in step 2, it's a pretty big one, and that is, of course, getting that offer of employment. Well, how do they get the offer of employment? They have to contact employers themselves. There's a job postings section on that website we'll take a look at in the next couple of slides here. And then, yeah, they have to see if they match up with those community requirements and see if they can immigrate through this program here. So, of course, they want to make sure that now the people in charge of this program here, so it would be the Sault Ste. Marie officials, well, they would really want to make sure that it's a person who can benefit from living in that community. They want to make sure that the community can benefit from having that person in there. Now, a lot of the times this is economic, where they would have, if you think kind of generally, if a person is immigrating to a specific community, well, if that person can settle in there economically, if they can settle in terms of having their kids go to school and that type of thing, it's perfect. It's really win-win for both of the groups. So when we think of what types of jobs that Sault Ste. Marie needs filled, they give us very specific examples over here. So you can see all the knock jobs that they feel that they need to hire foreign nationals for. So remember, in any case, in any system, one of those general ideas that we would always need to take a look at is whether or not a Canadian or permanent resident can do this job. Let's say that there are Canadian citizens or permanent residents in Sault Ste. Marie who can do this job or who are looking for work in, let's say, a knock 11 job. Well, I mean, the officers would definitely explore why those people could not take that job, right? Okay, so with this, we need to take a look, of course, step back, take a look if Sault Ste. Marie, if these companies, these businesses within this program are truly, genuinely not able to hire a Canadian or permanent resident to do this job. So it's similar to LMIAs. When we talked about LMIAs in our big LMIA lesson, well, we had the same idea. So that goes across the whole spectrum of immigration. When we have this idea of job offers, we always need to confirm that the company cannot hire a Canadian or permanent resident. That's one of the main elements we need to look for. Another one, of course, is that the person can do this job. We'll take a look at that in this context in a few slides over here. But it's pretty interesting to look at all of these different jobs and take a look at Sault Ste. Marie really and see that there is a need for people to work in these places. So when we go and take a look at this through the perspective of what we're talking about, which is community requirements, well, we're right in the middle of looking at the RNIP requirements, but when we look at those community requirements, we can see there's a points system in here. So a job offer gives 55 points in one of these areas. We're going to take a look at the other points just briefly as well. I don't think you need to know this really thoroughly for the exam, of course, but again, just so we have a good idea of how this works in real life and, of course, theoretically. All right, so as we continue with looking at the points from Sault Ste. Marie, well, we could see that they are looking for indicators, really, that a person can integrate into that society easily. So you can see that they have the work experience, just like everything else, right? But you can see at the bottom here, there's some really good ones. Being already a resident of the community, so owning a property, leasing a property, so that's perfect. I mean, a person who rents an apartment or a house or something in Sault Ste. Marie, great. I mean, it shows that they already live in that society. If they have family members in that community as well, it's plus 10 points. So really, we saw in the previous slide that it is a 70-point requirement, and they get a lot of points really for having family in that community because, again, Sault Ste. Marie feels that a person with family in the community already would stay in the community, benefit, and be able to easily integrate or more easily integrate into that community. Okay, and with this section here, you can see how friendly it is for people who have never lived in Sault Ste. Marie before. So you can see that it's similar to some of the PNPs that we've seen as well. I'm thinking of a couple of them where they do have a points system, and really they just want to see if there are ties to the community and how easily, of course, the person can integrate into that society. So if a person visited Sault, had interviews and that type of thing, perfect. It helps a lot with those points. The person's spouse as well, because remember, the spouse will likely immigrate with the person, himself or herself, and that would be two people to integrate into that society. So you can see all the additional points that a person can get for all of these areas, even if they have never been to Sault Ste. Marie before. Now, if we think a little bit outside the context of this local community here, really for a lot of the people who are going to go through the RNIP, they'll most likely be people who are outside of Canada and have never been in those communities before, though as we'll see later on, the program is a very good fit for people who are already in the community who want to stay. Okay, so let's go back to the RNIP requirements now. So we saw a bit of the link between all of the different steps in here, right? So remember, right at the beginning of the lesson, we took a look at the federal requirements. Well, we said that the federal requirements have to be met, of course, the RNIP requirements have to be met, of course, and the community requirements have to be met. So let's take a step back to the RNIP requirements here. Now, at a minimum, in terms of education, you have really very similar to what the Federal Skilled Worker Program needs, right? So a minimum high school diploma. ECA verified, of course. Remember, when they say 5 years, it's because the ECA verification expires in 5 years, similar to how language exams results expire within 2 years. So this might seem pretty easy, and it is if we're only looking at the RNIP requirements. However, remember that a person needs to prove they can do the job. Now, for a lot of the jobs that we saw in one of the previous slides with Sault Ste. Marie, well, a high school diploma would probably not meet the requirements of proving that the person has the education, the training to do that job. So when we see this in the RNIP section, it doesn't mean that a person with a high school diploma has met the minimum requirements, right? Because we need to take a look a little bit deeper and see the community requirements for this. All right, so the whole reason why we are working through this is to make sure that you are covered for your upcoming exam. Now, in order to do this, what we do, of course, is we take a whole lot of information and compress it into something that can help you maximize the amount of time you are spending on this particular topic, because you're going to have, of course, a lot more topics to cover, as you know. So we'll try to get through this one a bit faster, and this is an important piece of this step, really, and that is to know that these 4 categories here are linked together. So we're going to see this more in the next couple of slides here, but it goes to the general idea that a person has to, of course, have the ability to do the job and the intent, of course, to do the job. That's how job offers work. It's not just a job offer just for fun or because a person's friend is helping him out or something like that. Remember that it all has to be linked to the person's ability, to what the person can do. How can you measure this? Well, through work experience, through education, as we saw in the previous slide, through language. Okay, so to explore this idea a little bit further, let's take a look at this slide here. So we have the work experience requirements. Now you can see that it's similar to some other programs in that the person has to have 1 year experience, but this has to be within the last 3 years. Okay, so when they say 1 year experience, remember a part-time equivalent is accepted, so similar to other programs. If that experience is overseas, that's no problem. If that experience is in Canada, well, that's no problem either. except of course that Canadian experience, just like any other Canadian experience, has to be legally done. So if a person was here and didn't have a work permit and was working illegally, well, that person cannot use that experience as a part of meeting these requirements, and the person might have a bit more of a difficult time in applying for any other type of program under the IRCC. Okay, so we have this related to the NOC, so just like any other experience, when we look at federal skilled worker, Canadian experience class, anything like that too, the person has to, of course, have completed all of the actions listed in the lead statement of the NOC and a substantial number of those main duties. Now, if a person was self-employed, this doesn't count. So just like most other economic programs, if a person was not paid, well, it just does not count. Now, how does this relate to the other areas that we discussed before? Well, it links to the job offer. So if a person receives a job offer, we're going to look at this a bit more thoroughly in the next few slides as well. We'll see what it says exactly on the IRCC website. But to work through it kind of quickly, well, the person can basically have a similar level of experience, and that experience could qualify for this program. So in this one here, if the job offer is NOC O, well, if the person has NOC A experience or NOC O experience, perfect. That experience proves that he can do the job. For NOC A, for A and B, it's a little bit different. So it's kind of one above and one below, really, for those two. For C, it's one above and C itself. And for NOC D, it's NOC D experience. So if a person is trying to accept a NOC D job offer, but his or her experience is only in a NOC A job, well, that would not qualify for this program. Now, the language requirements play a role in this as well, and the language requirements needed depends on the job offer that the person has. So the lower the job offer in terms of NOC, the lower the language requirements. And this makes sense because when you think of a NOC D job, well, maybe it's like a construction worker or something like that, a laborer, a general laborer who might not need that much communication in order to do the job. If you move up to a NOC O, kind of a managerial type position, well, maybe a CLB6 is sufficient to demonstrate to the officer that the person can do that job, can speak to clients, can speak to staff in English or French, most of the time English, because this would be Western Canada, of course. Okay, so how do we relate this to the exam? Well, we need to, again, think of what we discussed before, which is we need to go a little bit deeper. So we have the federal government requirements, we have the RNIP requirements, and we have the community requirements. So the community requirements cannot go lower than this. So let's say a community says we need general laborers for a construction company, and those laborers do not need to display any English knowledge because the owner of the company speaks Spanish. Well, that would contravene those requirements of the RNIP. So similar to a regular PMP cannot kind of do whatever they want to do, right? Similar with those communities. So the communities cannot go lower in terms of language than what is listed here. Okay, so when we go to the job offer itself, well, it links with the employment requirements in that a person needs to prove they can do the job. So for the job offer itself, it has to be from a local business in the nominating community. So you can't have a business that's maybe nearby or in a different community who is using the RNIP to help a person obtain PR and work for that company, right? It has to be a local community. So it's a good idea to think of these community requirements as similar to PMPs. So if a province is nominating a person, it's not to go to another province, right? It's so that the person can live in that province. Well, for this program, if a person is being nominated by a community under the RNIP, it's so that the person can live and work in that community. So that's part of the job offer. It has to be a full-time job offer, non-seasonal, and there can't be a specific end date on this. Okay, and then we talked about that work experience already. This is exactly what it says on the RNIP website. Like we talked about before, really for NOC AB, it's experience above or below or equal. For NOC O, it's a NOC O or A. And for D, it's D. Okay, so for language, now I don't want to get into language too much. I think we've covered this in so many videos that you probably have a really strong foundation of how to link CLB with language exam scores, with specific language exam scores, with, of course, the requirements of certain programs. If not, you have the perfect chart for this in your test day data booklet, so get used to that page. And this is what it says on the eligibility requirements page of the RNIP. So they just say that, well, just what every other program says really, that the language testing has to be TEF, TCF, IELTS, CELPIP. 2 years old, of course, those exam results expire every 2 years. And they talk about the NOC itself. So a person needs certain language requirements in order to be able to prove that they have the ability to do certain jobs. Okay, and that work experience. So we talked about this before already, but yeah, you've got this is exactly what it says on the website. I think we've simplified it quite a bit in the material and in that previous slide that we saw. So it's the 1 year continuous full-time work experience or part-time, of course. Substantial number of duties, lead statement. So we know all of this, of course. The person has to have been legally able to do the job as well. And of course, at the bottom, it's those areas that do not count. So self-employed does not count. And if a person, let's say a person, for the last little sentence here, let's say a person was here studying in Canada and they have work experience during that time. So let's say it's 20 hours per week and they did this for 2 years. Well, perfect. I mean, if that person was legally allowed to work here in Canada, fantastic. But work experience can be difficult to obtain, difficult to prove, so there is an exemption. So I think they wisely put this in because, again, communities want to retain international students, right? So for Canada, I mean, I've discussed this 100 times. I think you know my thoughts on international students. And for all of you, I'll tell you very quickly once more, it's the best. International students are good for everybody. It's so good for the country. It's so good for the student themselves because especially if people are using kind of that method of immigrating where they come here as a student and then transition to immigration, it's a total home run for everybody because, of course, there are so many immigration options after the person graduates. And you just think of the person integrating into Canadian society. Well, the person has a Canadian degree, Canadian work experience. They obviously like living here in Canada and want to stay. So I think it's just win, win, win for the country, for the person, for the local community. And this program reflects exactly that because you have these people graduating from local universities or colleges in the cities that are part of the RNIP. And those communities want to keep these graduates after they graduate. So why not give them an exemption for work experience? So there's two kind of variations of this. One is for someone who graduated with a 2-year credential, and the other one is for people who graduated with a master's degree or higher. Now, for both of those, there are some commonalities. The person had to have been a full-time student for the whole duration of that program. There's a time limit, so the person had to graduate within the last year and a half. Had to graduate from, of course, the college or university or whatever in the local community, in the nominating community, and lived in that community as well for a certain amount of time. So just like, then the bottom point there is similar to postgrad work permit. where if a person studied ESL, FSL, so English as a second language, French as a second language, for more than 50% of their program, well, they're not eligible for this. Same thing if the person has a scholarship that requires him or her to return to their country after graduating, well, it's the same thing. They wouldn't qualify for this program. All right, and finally, proof of funds. So a person needs to, of course, be able to prove that they have enough money to support themselves and their family when they arrive in Canada. And how can they do this? Well, through proving that they have this money on hand. So they call it unencumbered funds. So it means that they can prove this through their bank accounts. If they have money orders and that type of thing, they can prove it through that. They cannot borrow money from a cousin or a friend or whatever to prove this and then send the money back. And they have to also include non-accompanying family members in this amount. So if a person has maybe a kid who's not coming with them right now, but maybe the person's child is going to join them in 6 months, well, that person needs to include that child as part of the family and prove the correlating funds with that as well. All right, so now we've seen all of those specific requirements for the RNIP. We've seen this in two ways. So we've seen this from the communities themselves in the previous video, and we've seen this now with the applicant, the foreign national himself or herself as well. So we've seen that there is a link between the community requirements and the RNIP requirements, and that a person needs to meet, of course, all of the requirements. So the person needs to meet the community requirements, the RNIP requirements, and the federal requirements in order for this to be the perfect program for them. And in conclusion, a big thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the good work that you are doing and working through, of course, all of these lessons. You're going to see that. I think this is one where really the RNIP is part of the future of immigration. We're going to see more and more localized programs as the years carry on. So I hope you embrace this opportunity to learn about this in the context of your exam, of course, but really in the context of thinking of the future business you're going to have and what types of programs you really want to specialize in. All right, so thank you so much, everybody. Have a fantastic day.